All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Student and ECP webinar series that we're hosting today. Today is focused on technical writing, and we'll get a presentation by Dave Adler. So thank you all for attending. It looks like we've got quite a few participants today, so I appreciate you all taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. I am Hannah Weaver, the 2025 Early Career Professional Representative for the Executive Committee for AIPG. Professionally, I work in the Orphan Dwellers Program Office within the Department of the Interior. And I'm an early career professional myself, background in geology and geophysics. And I'm carrying on this webinar series that's was introduced a few, I think, ECP reps ago, and just aimed at students and ECPs. But this webinar topic in particular is really something you can carry on throughout your whole career, not just early in your career. So again, this is focusing on technical writing, specifically for geoscientists. It's presented by Dave Adler. Dave has 40 plus years of professional experience in consulting and consulting for environmental and engineering projects, particularly major public works construction projects. He has a bachelor's degree in geology from Michigan Technological University, and he specialized in engineering and environmental geology, underground construction, and technical report writing and peer review. He was also featured as a mentor in our mentor program webinar a couple months ago, if you were attending that as well. He is an AIPG mentor to numerous ECPs, early career professionals, and geoscience students. All right, so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dave. Post-presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So you are welcome to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand when we get to that portion of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the AIPG YouTube page at a later date. So you can find it there likely in a few weeks or months. So I think that wraps up my introduction portion. So Dave, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and share your screen and get started.
Okay, thank you, Hannah.
You're welcome. And it looks like it's still loading on my end. Okay, there, I can see it now.
Okay, so as Hannah mentioned, I spent most of my 40-year career in consulting engineering and environmental consulting, and I wrote more technical reports than I can remember, and I've reviewed many technical reports. And so this comes from my experience in the consulting engineering and environmental consulting world, but I think technical report writing and what we're going to talk about today also extends into just about any kind of profession that geologists and geoscience people get into, whether it's mining, oil and gas production, exploration, government, USGS, state geological surveys, regulatory positions, and academia. So these are some of the topics we're going to talk about today a little bit. This is pretty fundamental, basic stuff. And so some of you may have heard it already, but hopefully it'll be a good refresher for those who have. And I found doing interviews with students looking for their first career position as geologists or geophysicists and whatnot, and early career professionals interviewing for jobs, that technical writing wasn't something that they were really taught too much in college. You're not expected to come out of college with great, highly developed technical writing skills, but if you do have those skills when you get out of college, it really sets you apart. And it's also important when you start your career as a professional. So our objectives today, the main objective is to help students and ECPs improve their technical writing skills and develop their skills better so as they develop and grow as professionals. But there's also a quality and pride part of it that comes into play. And what you produce in your technical report writing is going to be read and judged by others, and it reflects who you are and how you present yourself. The quality of your technical writing reflects on you and the company or organization that you're writing for, and you want to take ownership. Your name may be on the report. Your company's name or organization's name is almost certainly going to be on the report. And if your name isn't on it now, it'll probably be on it later on in your career. Um, and you want to produce the best possible product under the given constraints. And there's often a number of constraints we work under: schedule, budget, a limited scope of work, data gaps, and all these things. And I think the last thing that's important to me, and I think is really important to AIPG, is this is about sustainability for the future of our profession. AIPG is huge on promoting geology as a profession and the sustainability of that profession. And hopefully this is going to contribute to that today. So getting started in a perfect world, um, the first thing you want to do is compile and assemble elements of the report, starting with an outline or a table of contents. Um, you can start with general topics and then get more specific into subtopics. Figures, graphics, and tables are probably the most important things you want to develop before you start writing the report. And then the appendices, the attachments, a reference list if you're using references, and a glossary um, if you have such a thing. And then you write the report. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, it doesn't always work this way. The world isn't perfect, but this is kind of an optimum way I was taught, and I found out quickly on that this is the best way to approach it. And whenever you can, it's especially important with the figures and tables. That's what you're going to be talking about in your report more than anything. And if you have those in front of you, if you know what's in them and what they look like, what their names and numbers are, then it makes it a lot easier to streamline the report writing, and you won't have to go back quite so much and fill things in and change things. Um, Appendices or attachments are important. You need to know the order that they come in, the order they're introduced in the report, what's going to be in them. The same thing with figures and tables. You need to know the table numbers, the table names, where they're going to appear in the report, the order. You don't want table 3 introduced in your report before table 2, things like that. So again, these may seem kind of elementary, but they're important, and the details are important. Even the small and seemingly trivial details are important. And that's a point I want to emphasize, to be detail oriented in report writing. I found some example tables of contents that I just wanted to show. They have some things in common. Typically, they start with an abstract or what is sometimes called an executive summary, although those aren't always the case, aren't always included in reports. They're not required. This one's a USGS professional paper. They almost always have abstracts and then an introduction, and then it goes through the different elements of the report. And towards the end, you'll have references. This one has an index, and then the figures. Now, this one doesn't have a figure 1. I believe there was a plate 1 for this, an oversized plate that was a big map. And I don't know why that's not mentioned in the table of contents in this one, but it isn't for some reason. This was a USGS report about the geology of the Precambrian geology in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which I'm from Michigan and belong to the AIPG Michigan section. This is a table of contents from a environmental report that I had a hand in writing. This one was for the Gordie Howe International Bridge Project, which is almost finished now, between the new bridge they're constructing between Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And this was about PCB and NAPL, non-aqueous phase liquid, contamination at one of the bridge parcels that had been acquired to build the bridge. And this was a pretty extensive report. So you can see it has an introduction. This one didn't have an executive summary. Um, you'll see at the bottom, summary and references. This one doesn't have conclusions or recommendations, and not all reports have those, but some do. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes here because it's an important point, especially recommendations. Um, References are something I used a lot in my reports. In the consulting world, I didn't see them often enough. Same as with footnotes, but I like to use references and footnotes and cite the references in the report and then have a reference list at the end that matches what was cited in the report. And this is the second page of that same report table of contents. Typical order of things would be figures, tables, and then appendices or attachments in the table of contents and then in the report. Figures are typically included within the text of the report when the figure is first cited, although sometimes they can be put at the end of the report or in an attachment. Um, Figures and tables actually often go at the end of the report before the appendices or attachments, I should say. I correct that. And but sometimes they'll go within the body of the report, and sometimes they'll go in their own attachments or appendices. This was a mineral resource evaluation report that I found online. This one has a really extensive table of contents. I found some where the table of contents was 20 pages or more. This one was only 4 pages. And as you can see, it starts with an abstract, which is similar to an executive summary, and an introduction. It goes through the various elements of the report, and then down at the bottom, it has references. This one has acknowledgments, which is you don't see too often, but that's a good thing to have if it's appropriate. And then the appendices. And then it talks about the figures, the tables, and this one had a glossary of conversion factors and abbreviations, which is pretty useful sometimes. You don't see this too often, but in the mineral exploration world and oil and gas exploration, you will see this kind of thing more and more. And it also had another acronyms and abbreviations list. This report happened to be in the public sector. A lot of mineral evaluation reports and exploration reports are proprietary, and you won't find them shared with the public. But this one was. This was sponsored by a United Nations agency. Um, this is something that I find a lot of people overlook when they write reports, and that's knowing who your audience is so that you can write the report for the reader, the primary reader. Um, Whoever is commissioned you to write this report, whether it's a client, whether it's a public domain report for a geological survey or an academic report for research, um, whatever it is. And so the main elements, there's a lot of different kinds of audiences, but the main um, difference is technical versus non-technical audiences. And within technical audiences, there's different levels of technical knowledge and expertise for the audience. And that'll help you determine the level of detail that's needed when you write the report. A lot of reports are either written for the public domain or end up in the public domain. If you're an environmental consultant, which a lot of geologists are, you may write a report for a private client, but that report is going to go to a regulatory agency. And when it does, a state regulatory agency is typical, it becomes a public domain document. You may be working on something that's privileged and confidential, and that involves attorneys, litigation situations, or multiple stakeholders. And in that case, you need to be a little more careful of what you write and what you say. You have to be cautious and realize that there are attorneys and there is litigation going on and there are multiple stakeholders. There could be technical committees and steering committees and third-party consultants that are going to be looking at the reports you develop. You could be writing for government personnel and regulators. Some of the reports that we work on are on orphan sites, as Hannah works on for the federal government with abandoned oil and gas wells. And those are typically written by consultants or researchers for government people to use, and they're the main audience. But they also become public domain documents usually. You could be writing something for a decision policymakers. This is especially true in oil and gas production and in oil and gas and mineral exploration, um, and on and on. And there's different types of audiences, sometimes combinations of different types of audiences that you're going to be writing for. And so you want to tailor the level of detail and the tone of the report and how much background information you give and how you explain things to the audience, the main audience, and then secondary audiences if it's going to be a public domain document in particular. Structure and style. Well, everybody has a different style, but there's some basic rules or some basic guidelines. One topic per paragraph, as expressed in the lead sentence, is very standard in technical report writing. You want to move from the general to the particular, both within a paragraph and within sections of the report. And a good example would be you might start out describing the geology of a site by starting with the regional geology, then the site geology, and then you might get into the hydrogeology or the groundwater geology or the mineralization or those kind of things. So general to the particular is usually a good way to go. Avoid overly long paragraphs. I feel that 3 to 6 sentences is enough for a paragraph. If you have more than 5 or 6 sentences in a paragraph, you ought to think about splitting that into 2 paragraphs and making sure that there aren't 2 topics being talked about there, because if there are, you want to split one topic per paragraph and split it into 2 paragraphs. Active voice is preferable. I hear that a lot. I don't know how important that is, but I do hear it. It's kind of a general rule. Use bullets and number lists. I think these are a great way to just get points across. Undefined acronyms are a no-no. I was particularly tough on that with people, and create a glossary if you need to. And anybody who's worked with EPA reports knows how taxing sometimes acronyms can be. So avoid awkward sentences and expressions. These are usually going to be caught by whoever reviews your report, and they're going to tell you this is awkward. They may ask you to rewrite it and clarify what you're trying to say, or they may suggest ways to clarify it for you, either one. Um, Selective redundancy is something that is often a good thing to use because you want to drive a point home. You want to support your conclusions, and sometimes you need to bring this out more than once. I'm a big user of footnotes. I didn't see it too much from other people in the consulting engineering world, but I like using footnotes. I think they're a great way to explain things and to augment what you're writing. Avoid words that can be ambiguous or misconstrued, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. And most importantly, I think you want to show that you're a polished professional. You want to write in an articulate way, meaning clear, concise, well formulated, and convincing. Those are all kind of definitions of articulate writing. And if you can, even though it's sometimes hard in technical writing, to be eloquent, compelling, persuasive, and vividly expressed. Now, let's face it, technical reports aren't going to make people cry too often. But every once in a while, I see some that are so well written that they do make me think that this person really has outstanding qualities of writing and eloquence. Um, some words to avoid. The number one word I was taught early on from day one was all. It's a word you want to try and avoid whenever possible. There are a few exceptions. In the environmental world, there's an ASTM standard called all appropriate inquiry, which is used for environmental site assessments. And so the word all is built into that title of that standard. Um, but I found that when you want to use the word all, you can almost always substitute the word the or each of. Every is another word you want to avoid because, like all, it means everything in this universe and every other universe, no exceptions. And usually that's not what we're trying to say. Always is a similar kind of word you can substitute in each instance. Never is a word that you probably don't want to use too often because you you have to be really sure of yourself to use that word never. And words like rarely or none are good substitutes. The word around, I don't like it. I just think it sounds a little bit awkward or crude. I think approximately is a much better word to use in technical reports. Mostly similar, I think predominantly or primarily are better words. Mostly is not that bad. About, I think approximately is a much more appropriate word for a technical report. And the other definition of about, I think it's better to say regarding or pertaining to. Um, but is a word you don't want to use in a technical report. However, or moreover are much better words, or just not use it at all. And so is a word you don't see too much in technical reports. And I think therefore is a good substitute for that one. Um, some other words that you have to be careful with that I would see a lot when I reviewed technical reports. It's versus it's with an apostrophe, insure versus ensure. I still see this one a lot, almost everywhere. Ensure doesn't get used enough in its proper meaning, and insure gets misused. Affect versus affect. One is a noun, one is a verb. This next one can be tricky. Waste versus discarded materials versus refuse versus debris. In the environmental world, these words can have specific meanings that are part of the regulations, and they can differ from place to place. And so you want to be careful when you call something a waste that you're using that word properly according to the regulatory definition that's in a statute or in a regulation somewhere. Um, Toxic versus hazardous versus regulated. These are the same things. Hazardous has a very specific meaning under the RCRA federal regulations. Toxic and is a little tougher to define sometimes from place to place and may have different meanings in different places. Regulated, if you say regulated substances, that's usually a pretty safe way to go without having to wade through the definitions of toxic or hazardous or things like that. Attempt versus endeavor. I don't like attempt so much because it makes it sound like you might have given up or something. Licensed versus registered. This can be important in certain states. Whether surveyors are licensed or registered, if you've had work that's been surveyed, makes a difference in which state you're in. Professional engineers, licensed versus registered, same kind of thing. Evidence versus indications or indicators. I try to avoid the word evidence because it also has legal connotations and legal definitions, and you may not want to be caught in that. Should, must, and will. Now, these are words that will sometimes come into play in recommendations in a technical report. and they have different meanings. Should is a pretty easy word to use. Must and will are much more definitive words with much stronger connotations, and you want to be careful if you say something must be done or something will be done or something versus something should be done, or someone should do something versus someone must or will do something, because there are ramifications down the line as to how you word that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about conclusions and recommendations here. A few more: contaminated versus impacted. And again, these words can have different meanings in different places, some of which are part of the regulations themselves. Landfill versus a containment facility versus a dump versus a disposal site. Landfills usually refer to licensed landfills. Containment facility can mean just about anything, any kind of landfill. A dump typically, to me, is an unlicensed or unregulated landfill, or perhaps a pre-regulations era landfill. And there's a lot of those out there, as anybody in environmental consulting knows. There's a lot of old pre-regulations era landfill sites, dumps that we work on. Disposal site is a pretty neutral term, like containment facility, and is usually a pretty safe way to go. Unregulated versus pre-regulations era. Um, I like pre-regulations era if I know that's the case, but again, that differs from place to place. Abandon versus decommission. This is one that's kind of one of my pet peeves. In Michigan, we deal a lot with monitoring wells and water supply wells that we decommission, meaning we usually over drill them, we pull the well assemblies, and we grout them up with an environmentally safe bentonite grout. Abandon means you turn your back on something and walk away. And in the consulting engineering and environmental consulting world, that usually isn't the case. We usually don't do that. We usually decommission wells. Now, in the world that Hannah lives in, where she deals with orphan wells on a national basis, oil and gas wells, there are a lot of abandoned wells out there. Now, unfortunately, in Michigan, the regulators years ago baked the word abandon into their standards for decommissioning water supply wells. And so abandon became a common term that's still used in Michigan when it's really intended to be decommissioning. So it's unfortunate that that happens. In the environmental world, bentonite is one. Bentonite pellets aren't used much anymore, if at all. I still see that word though. Um, Hydrated bentonite, bentonite grout, cement bentonite grout. These are all different ways to express how monitoring wells are structured and how wells are decommissioned, and water supply wells also. And so you want to be careful about exactly how you express that. And usually when I would talk about um, monitoring well construction or well decommissioning, I would give the brand name and the maker of the bentonite grout or bentonite chips or whatever it is that were being used, just to be specific about it. And to document that that was done in an environmentally sound and acceptable way. Survey versus inspect. Again, these terms, if you're doing an asbestos survey or you're inspecting a building before demolition for asbestos, you want to be careful how you word that. In some states, like Michigan, um, asbestos inspection is licensed. We have licensed asbestos inspectors in Michigan, licensed by the state. Not all states may have that. I don't know who does and who doesn't. So you want to be a little bit careful about that. You don't want to imply that something that um, isn't really true, that you're an accredited inspector if you're not. And so survey might be a better word there. But again, it depends on where you're doing the work. And examined versus observed. Examined is a little stronger word than observed. It's more like inspect. I think observed is a little more like survey. So be careful with words like that. And when in doubt, don't hesitate to refer that question to someone higher up, the project manager, the task manager, whoever gave you the assignment to write the report, and they'll help you. Graphics. This is a rapidly changing field and it's always getting better and better. It's hard to keep up. I was fortunate to be able to draw on people who were much better than me at doing graphics for support. But a good base drawing or map is always the way to start. Using an aerial drone photo, LiDAR, ArcGIS, and Rockware are good programs to use for this. And then you can go ahead and make things like contour maps, cross sections, geologic profiles, fence diagrams. You can show where your geologic profiles are on a plan view map. Graphic representation of spatial or temporal data is important in environmental consulting. Extent of contamination drawings, extent of um, waste fill. If you're looking at an old undocumented landfill, how big is the landfill? You can show that on a air photo or on a drone photo or on a topographic map or whatever your base map is. Um, Photo documentation and photo logs, I use these a lot. I think they really are important. They really help tell the story. And I'm going to show an example of that in a minute. Public domain resources and including the reference are also really good ways to put together graphics. And I've got an example of that because there's a lot of great maps out there in the public domain that are available to use for technical reports, as long as you cite the source and the reference where those um, resources came from. Be creative, think outside the box, or hopefully get the support of somebody who's really good at those things in making graphics. Um, and don't hesitate to ask for assistance. Not all of us are gifted with creativity and graphics, and it's great if you have somebody who can help you with that. So this is a photo log for a report I did a couple years ago. We were up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, drilling on land and off a barge. We were soil sampling, sediment sampling, and rock coring. And these are just some of the photos of some of the field activities. And I think it really helps tell the story of the work that was done and helps justify the money that went into it. I can tell you this work is very expensive. Working from a barge, rock coring, and rock coring from a barge is especially expensive, and it helps justify. And even I would even refer to certain photos in the photo log in the report when I was talking about certain things, so that the reader could see just what we were doing instead of just reading about it. This is a public domain geologic map that I used. This one actually comes from an article I wrote for the AIPG Michigan section quarterly newsletter, but I used this very same base map for a project that was done right here in the Chatham area, about 10 miles south of the Eben ice caves. And this was from a report by a guy named Van Leer. It was a USGS professional paper, I think, or water resources report. And so I referenced him at the bottom, and this reference is included in the reference list at the end of the article and at the end of the report that I use this map for. And I call it modified um, because Van Leer wasn't, he was the source, but it was modified by me by adding this label of the Eben ice caves and the dot where the location of the ice caves is. And so modified is the way to express that in the reference for the figure, because Van Leer's original report doesn't have that on there. It's slightly different. Um, the review process. For those of you who are early career professionals, you've probably been through this, and students, if you haven't been through it, you will go through it. The most important thing I can say is to embrace this process because it's standard in academia, in consulting engineering, environmental consulting, in research and mapping. It's standard just about everywhere you're going to be writing technical reports. Don't take it personally because it isn't intended to be personal, um, and learn from it. We learn from our mistakes. If we don't make mistakes, we really don't learn much. And it's all about improving your writing skills through iteration. I can tell you that technical writing gets easier the more you do it. And I think that's a universal truth. The details are important, as I mentioned earlier, even the minute and seemingly trivial details. And please try and stay focused on that as you write reports, because again, it reflects back on who you are and your commitment to excellence and the commitment to excellence of whoever you're working for or whatever organization you're affiliated with. Let's say it's the USGS or a state geological survey. When you submit a draft report to a reviewer, you're going to get it back marked up with comments, edits, things like that, questions. Um, you want to incorporate those edits and comments, and you want to follow up and resolve them as necessary. You may get comments back from the reviewer that you don't understand, and it's possible that the reviewer didn't understand what you were writing. It can go both ways, and so you want to resolve all those. And the bottom line is the review process is all about developing and growing as a professional. Um, and again, like I say, this gets infinitely easier as you go on. And at some point in your career, you're likely to move from being the technical report writer to also being a technical report reviewer and helping people with less experience than you to develop and grow as professional. And one thing to keep in mind that I've always tried to remember is that no matter how many technical reports you do, no matter how many years experience you have, you can always learn from new things and do better. Late in my career, I would review things that I had written 6 months ago, had forgotten about, and then I found things in there that I didn't like, and I asked myself, why did I write that? How could I do something like that? And so it's a process that never stops. Continuous improvement never stops. It's like the quest for the perfect margarita. It never ends. For me, anyway. Some miscellaneous tips. Understand the document's objectives. Know what you're writing about. You want to stay focused. You don't want to drift onto tangents or speculate about outside issues. That just muddies the waters and confuses the reader and gets you off track. Using standardized language can be important, especially in environmental consulting. Um, Sometimes the reader will recognize and understand certain kinds of language. For example, in Michigan, the state regulators like to use the term multiple lines of evidence. And so in reports, sometimes I would say, based on multiple lines of evidence, and give those certain lines of evidence, and that helps convince the regulatory personnel of the point you're trying to make. Using professional judgment and opining. In technical reports, we usually don't talk about our opinions. We talk about professional judgment. You'll see a lot of technical reports in the environmental consulting world and in the consulting engineering world, where it says based on the available data and information and professional judgment. Well, that basically is the same as saying in our professional opinion. And so when we use professional judgment, it's okay to say that because we are giving an opinion essentially based on our expertise, which is usually what we're hired to do in the first place, is use our expertise in geology and geophysics and whatnot, and geological engineering to work on a project and then report on that project through the technical report, which is the deliverable. Most technical reports have summaries. A lot of them have conclusions. Some have recommendations. A summary is pretty standard. I would say it's necessary. Um, Occasionally, you'll see a scope of work where you don't want that, or it's just a data report, but usually a summary and conclusions are given. Recommendations may or may not be given. Your client or whoever has commissioned you to write that report may or may not want you to give recommendations. And if you do give recommendations, you have to be careful with those because, one, if you give a recommendation for something that is correct, a good recommendation, and then whoever you're giving that recommendation to doesn't do that, that can cause ramifications for them down the line. Alternatively, if you give recommendations and those recommendations turn out to be less than stellar, then you can be on the hot seat down the line somewhere. And one way to get around that, instead of saying you recommend that something be done, you could recommend that something be considered to be done, which is sort of a backing away a little bit, but it gets your point across that something might need to be done and that someone should consider doing it. Typically, the writer of the technical report isn't the one that's going to be carrying out the recommendations. It's somebody else, whoever you're writing the report for. Um, and so recommendations, if you give them, can be tricky. In the environmental consulting world, um, some projects just don't call for recommendations. It's just not appropriate, and it's not always necessary. Um, if you use references, make sure you use them properly. Whatever format you use, I always like the USGS format, although that's not a single standard format, but there's a pretty basic one. Stick with it, be consistent. References that are cited in the text of the report have to be listed in the reference list. Everything in the reference list has to be cited in the report. I would sometimes see reports where there were references in the text that didn't show up in the reference list, and also references in the reference list that didn't show up in the text. And you've got to work those little bugs out before you finalize the report. Um, um, AI, I'm not an expert on AI. It kind of came into being towards the end of my career. It's a great tool, but I think, as everybody knows, it can really help us, but it has to be used very carefully. It can help us, especially with crunching data, analyzing data. In geophysics, this is especially important. Um, and it can also be used to help write reports. But there you want to be careful. You don't want to take shortcuts. You want to make sure that the report is your voice and not some AI voice, and that you've done your critical thinking and a thorough review and vetting process, and that you take ownership of the report. And so don't let AI trip you up. Use it carefully. It can be a very, very powerful tool, but it has its pitfalls too. And I think um, people know about that, and that's especially true in technical report writing. Um, you want to make this sound like you wrote it, not some AI program. Um, as we were putting this together, Hannah and I and Barb Bickford, who I'll talk about in a minute, who collaborated with us on this, there were some resources that we thought were important, that were pretty general and could help anybody and everybody with technical writing. Um, Mike Lawless did a webinar. Mike is former AIPG president. I think he's still president of the AIPG Foundation, or in charge of that. Um, There was another webinar by a guy from Virginia Tech, Stephen Holbrook, that I thought was really good. Elements of Style is a really well-known book, and a couple others. The Practical Geocommunication 3.0 webinar by Geologize is available free for members of AIPG through AIPG. And I've watched that, and it's a good series of webinars. It's not so much about technical report writing as it is about communication, but they're linked. They're closely linked. Um, and I believe we're recording this, so these will be listed on the recording. And if anybody wants to contact me, feel free. Here's my um, contact information. Hannah's, and Barb Bickford. Barb is a geologist and is an expert on scientific communication and narrative, and she collaborated on this webinar, and she is also a very good resource. And so Barb's contact information is giving there. And that's about it. So I think we have about 15 minutes left if there's questions or comments.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much, Dave. The been looking through the chat. There's lots of suggestions and additional tips that people have been sharing. So make sure everyone, gets a read through all of those. There's a lot of great information that's also shared there. One specific question that I saw come up in the chat was a question of a standard template to use. They cited, potentially a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers template potentially. Are you aware of any standard templates that could be helpful for writing technical reports?
Well, I don't know so much about standard templates, but it's common to use templates for previous reports that have been written. So a USGS has lots of reports out there that can be used as templates to see how to set up and structure a report. I don't know if there's a standard one or not. I'm not
Hmm.
aware of one. If anybody in the audience knows of that, or standard template, say for mineral exploration report, but just by looking at what other people have done, and in the environmental consulting and consulting engineering world, we used reports on a regular basis, previous reports as templates just to get started.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great advice. And I'm sure, obviously there's a lot out there that you could use, probably from even your own company or organization, if you just go back to a report that was previously published.
Yes, for example,
Um,
if you're doing a landfill groundwater monitoring report, which are done quarterly or semi-annually, those are pretty standard, and templates are there for that in your own company and
mhm.
or in the public domain, and it's good to stick with those templates
Yeah.
and use those
Yeah.
same style and structure.
Okay. One question had a question on the resources. So maybe while we're doing the Q&A, could you go back to the additional resources slide that had all those
Sure.
other things to check out?
This one?
Yes. Yeah. We'll just keep that up while we're going through questions, just so everyone can get a look at it. And then there was a question if they'll have access to the chat when this is over. I don't think you will have access to the chat after the webinar is over. But maybe Wendy or Kathy knows better than I do on that.
If there's a way to do that, I would like to see it because I would be particularly interested in the tips people have been offering, perhaps from um, different job sectors
Mhm.
other than consulting engineering and environmental consulting on tips on technical report writing. Because as I said, mine comes from the world I lived in, but there's other worlds for geologists out there, including, say, the regulatory world, like where you come from, Hannah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure. So Kathy or Wendy, let me know if we can or if there's a way we can save the chat history. Another question that came up was, do you recommend working from quote unquote working outlines pre-establishment of your table of contents? So I think that kind of goes back to the question of templates, maybe is kind of a similar, or I'm not sure exactly what they mean by working outlines.
Well, I think if I understand the question, I think for me, I would start with an outline. I guess the difference, I think it's a question of what's the difference between an outline and a table of contents, maybe. I would start with what I call an outline, which is just a list of topics, main topics I want to talk about. And then I would break the main topics down into subtopics. And then I would start deciding what order those things would be in. And then I could put table of contents numbers, section 1.0, section 1.1, 1.2, 1.2.1. And so the outline comes first, I think, and then you can make it more detailed and put it into a table of contents, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good point. Um, and Kathy did mention we do get a copy of the chat, so
Great.
we will have a copy of that, so that's great. Let's see. Any tips on how to write to non-technical audiences?
Yes, be general. Don't bog them down in detail. And you have to kind of to um, make a judgment on how much detail to give them. But if let's say you're talking about PFAS can be mind-boggling, and just the names of the PFAS compounds can drive people crazy, and that can be a real turnoff for the reader of the report. I think for a non-technical audience, you have to be very general and not get too far into the weeds of the regulations or the geological or geochemical details or whatever it is, the mineralogical details of what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah,
But
definitely.
for example, if you're working for the USGS or a state geological survey, those are going to both technical and non-technical audiences. And so you probably have to give both the details and the general stuff. And if people don't want to get bogged down in the details of the geochemistry or the mineralogy, they can skip through those parts.
Hmm. Okay. Another question on the use of specific terms, examined or observed, which is more specific or which is preferred there, would you say?
I would say examined is more specific. This could get into a lawyer argument, and I don't want to get into that. I think observed is a little more general. Um,
Okay.
Examined means you looked at something carefully. Observed, I think, is more of a meaning that you saw something, but you weren't even necessarily looking for it.
Hmm. Hmm. A question on photo logs. Can photos be standalone figures or do they need to be in a photo log, would you say?
Boring logs, is that what you said?
Photo
Oh,
logs.
photo logs are usually, I usually use them as an appendix or an attachment.
Hmm. And
So
can you have a
all the photos
photo?
would be in one photo log.
Would you ever say you could have a photo kind of as a standalone figure, or if it's a
Sure.
photo, it should, oh, okay. All right.
And
Yep.
in USGS or State Geological Survey reports, you're probably going to see that more commonly.
Okay.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's always best to give that photo figure as close to where it's cited in the text as possible, preferably on the same page or on the next page, because
mhm.
otherwise the reader has to go looking for it.
Right. Yeah. Great point. I think that's most of the questions in the chat. If you put a question in and I haven't gotten to it, please just resubmit it so it comes back to the bottom because the chat's gotten quite lengthy. So while we're waiting on that, I had a question for you, Dave, related to writing reports, but more on reading and digesting reports. So is there any, advice on how to digest a technical report? I heard some advice, in grad school in reference to academic papers of which sections you should read first and not necessarily top to bottom. Is the same true, would you say, for technical reports?
Um, when I would review technical reports, I would usually take notes as I was reviewing them, but just reading them, I don't know if I had any preference. I can tell you though, in some places, all that people are going to read is the executive summary.
Mm,
That's that, or the abstract. Well, the executive summary is usually a little more detailed than an abstract, especially in the environmental consulting world. When you do a phase one or phase two environmental site assessment report, a lot of times that's all that is really important is the executive summary. And so
Mhm.
that part takes preference.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
Um, Another question came up in the chat. Do you have any advice in particular for grant writing? So not necessarily a technical report, but can maybe some of what you presented be used in grant writing, would you say?
Yeah, no, that's not really my expertise, but I have some experience with it. And I think grant writing is more in the communication area where you're trying to convince somebody that you deserve to be given this grant, this money, that the cause or the project you're working on is worthy of it. And also in grant writing, I think you have to write for the particular organization that's giving out the grant so that you tailor to their language and um, their qualities and their culture and their requirements.
Mhm. Okay.
But again, grant writing, there are people who what they do for a living is grant writing, even some
Mhm.
geologists. So maybe we can get one of them for a webinar.
Yeah, maybe that'll be our next topic. Um, Someone asked in the chat about getting credit for attending this webinar. I don't believe we're offering any PDH or other CEU type credit since this is a free webinar. So that is not available, I don't believe. Let's see. I think we'll give it another minute for people to add some questions to the chat. I'll throw out another question to you, Dave. Is there a difference between, appendices and attachments? I feel like I hear those terms used interchangeably.
I would say no. They're just different words for the same thing. In the environmental consulting and consulting engineering world, it's standard to call them appendices, but sometimes they get called attachments. They're essentially equivalent.
Okay, okay, good to know. Maxwell asks, Dave, what's your favorite mineral?
My
Question
favorite
for you.
mineral, I would say tourmaline,
All right. Let's
which is
see.
actually a family.
It's what's that?
It's a family of minerals, but
Oh, it's all encompassing then. Um, Do authors still describe geologic materials? Any standards for this? For example, oldest to youngest. Any interpretation usually given? Um,
say that again.
do authors, I'll just do one part of the question at a time. Do authors still describe geologic materials I guess, in reports?
Yeah, you mean from oldest to youngest, or
Yeah, and then the second part was, is there any standards for describing the geologic materials? For example, oldest to youngest.
um, I don't know if there is, but a good way to get a handle on that would be to look at some existing USGS reports, I think, and see how they do it. Um,
Mhm.
I want to say oldest rocks first and then youngest rocks, but I'm not sure that's right.
Yeah. Another question about executive summaries. Can executive summaries have a diagram summary like the ones we see in research manuscripts nowadays?
It wouldn't be in the executive summary, it would be in the table of contents. So I would say the answer there is probably is no.
Okay. Similar question that just came up while we were asking that one that I was thinking of is, can you have a figure in your executive summary? Maybe like an all-encompassing figure that really drives home the point. Would that be appropriate to include a figure in that part of the report?
I don't want to say you can't, but it's not very common.
Yeah. Okay.
Executive summary is usually just a bottom line thing. Um, and it's especially important in mineral resource or exploration reports and in environmental due diligence reports. It's especially important.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. This comment comes from Christopher. It says, during my Superfund years, worked with many law firms, and they developed a hierarchy of certainty. The data demonstrate, show, indicate, or suggest. I guess that's the hierarchy that he's using. Any thoughts on that hierarchy? So demonstrate, show, indicate, or suggest.
Yes, I like that. And I would
Yeah,
say if you're working with attorneys and they have that kind of structure of nomenclature, use it. And I think the one you just gave goes from the most confident, the most definite to the least confident and definite, meaning
yeah,
suggest. And so, yes, I think those are good.
yeah. That's great. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll wrap up. So, Dave, thank you so much for your presentation today. I think you reached a large audience. So, thank you all in the audience for participating, for your thoughtful questions. Thank you to Barb for your collaboration on this presentation, Barb Bickford. And thank you to AIPG for allowing us to host this. And yeah, I hope this was informative and useful for all. And thanks again, Dave.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks to everybody for participating.